The line between good and evil runs through the heart of every human being. These words from Alexander Solzhenitsyn struck me profoundly while examining documents at the Holocaust Museum. I still remember the chill that ran down my spine seeing photos of smiling Nazi collaborators, ordinary people with families and dreams. My research into how regular American soldiers participated in the My Lai massacre revealed a disturbing truth. The capacity for evil exists within ordinary systems we participate in daily. The most unsettling discovery wasn't finding monsters in history, but recognizing familiar patterns. By the end of this video, you'll never look at human behavior, or yourself, the same way again. The invisible architecture of evil. What if the greatest threat to your morality isn't some external villain, but the invisible social structures you participate in every day? I've spent years asking myself this question, especially after seeing how easily good people justify harmful actions when they're part of a system bigger than themselves. Most of us grow up with a comforting story about evil. We imagine that terrible acts require terrible people, monsters who look nothing like us. We picture cold-eyed sociopaths, people born without empathy, or individuals warped by trauma into something unrecognizable. This belief helps us sleep at night. It creates a psychological barrier between them, the bad people, and us, the good people who would never do such things. But history tells a different, more uncomfortable story. The Holocaust, the Rwandan genocide, and massacres like My Lai weren't carried out by exceptional monsters. They were executed by ordinary citizens, neighbors, civil servants, and average people who went home to their families after participating in unimaginable cruelty. This reality is so disturbing that our minds actively work to reject it. I've caught myself creating distance through psychological tricks. When reading about those who committed or enabled atrocities, I search for differences between them and me. They were from a different time, I think, or their culture was more violent. This mental distancing isn't accidental. It's a self-protective reflex that helps us avoid facing our shared humanity and vulnerability. Social psychology research over the past 70 years has consistently demonstrated that situational factors influence our behavior far more than personality traits or moral values. This contradicts our intuition that our actions flow from our character, that good people do good things and bad people do bad things. These invisible social structures function like a building's hidden framework, unseen but fundamentally determining what stands and what falls. Authority, group pressure, and institutional norms form the beams and joists that shape our moral choices, often without our awareness. Just as we rarely think about the structural engineering beneath our feet until something collapses, we seldom notice these social forces until they've already guided our actions. Philip Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment revealed how quickly college students randomly assigned as guards began mistreating fellow students designated as prisoners. Similarly, Stanley Milgram found that ordinary Americans would administer what they believed were painful electric shocks to innocent people simply because an authority figure instructed them to continue. These weren't sadists. They were regular people placed in situations that overwhelmed their individual moral compasses. What makes these findings so disturbing is their universality. The participants represented a cross-section of normal society. When researchers investigated personality factors that might predict who would resist versus comply, they found surprisingly few reliable indicators. The power of the situation consistently trumped individual differences. This brings us to the core framework of our exploration today. We'll examine the psychological mechanisms that lead ordinary people, people like you and me, to commit harmful acts. We'll investigate how authority short-circuits moral reasoning, how group dynamics transform individual behavior, how dehumanizing language makes cruelty possible, and how small compromises lead to major moral violations. I approach this investigation not as a moral judge, but as a detective uncovering hidden influences, the social structures and situational forces that can transform good intentions into harmful outcomes. My goal is understanding, because understanding is our best protection. This exploration will likely make you uncomfortable. It should. We're challenging a cherished self-perception, the belief that our moral character reliably protects us from participating in harmful systems. When examining how ordinary people became collaborators in atrocities or enforcers of injustice, we're not looking at distant others. We're examining human psychology, our psychology. This discomfort serves a purpose. It develops a healthier humility about our moral fragility. Instead of assuming we would always stand against injustice, we recognize our vulnerability to the same forces that have compromised others throughout history. This recognition strengthens our moral resolve by replacing naive confidence with informed vigilance. The answer to what turns ordinary people into perpetrators doesn't lie in individual pathology. It lies in universal human psychology and social dynamics. We all respond to authority, seek social approval, protect our self-image, and adapt to environments. These normal processes, in particular contexts, can override our individual moral values. Many participants in Milgram's experiments expressed astonishment at their own behavior. They discovered something universal about human susceptibility to authority. As one reflected afterward, "I've learned something about myself that I never knew before. I don't think I'm ever going to be able to look at myself exactly the same way." Understanding these mechanisms doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but points toward effective prevention. Rather than focusing exclusively on identifying bad people, we can design systems that account for human psychological vulnerabilities through accountability structures, distributed responsibility, oversight, and ethical checks. As we explore these psychological mechanisms, approach them with genuine curiosity rather than defensive distance. Ask yourself not, "Would I ever do that?" but, "Under what conditions might I be vulnerable to this influence?" This shift from confident denial to curious self-examination is the beginning of true moral growth. Let's start with what might be the most powerful force that can override individual moral judgment: authority. When Milgram designed his experiments in the early 1960s, he wanted to understand how ordinary Germans could participate in Nazi atrocities. What he discovered about authority's influence shocked the world and continues to challenge our understanding of human behavior today. Authority's deadly whisper, the Milgram revelation. How far would you go if someone in a lab coat simply asked you to continue? Would you inflict pain on an innocent person? Would you ignore their screams? Most of us immediately answer, no. We believe we would stand up, walk out, refuse to participate. But the evidence tells a different story about human nature, one that might be hard to accept about yourself. In 1961, a Yale psychologist named Stanley Milgram designed an experiment that would forever change our understanding of human behavior. The setup was simple but ingenious. Volunteers were told they were participating in a study about memory and learning. They were assigned the role of teacher and introduced to another participant, the learner, who was actually an actor working with Milgram. The teacher watched as the learner was strapped into a chair in an adjacent room, with electrodes attached to his wrist. The teacher's job seemed straightforward. Read a list of word pairs for the learner to memorize, test the learner's memory, and administer an electric shock whenever the learner made a mistake. The shock generator had 30 switches, labeled from 15 volts, slight shock, all the way up to 450 volts, XXX danger, severe shock. The teacher was instructed to increase the voltage with each wrong answer. As the experiment progressed, the learner deliberately gave incorrect answers. At 120 volts, he shouted about pain. By 150 volts, he demanded release. His screams intensified at higher voltages until eventually, after 330 volts, he fell completely silent, suggesting something terrible had happened. Whenever a teacher hesitated, the experimenter, a man in a grey lab coat, responded with increasingly firm prompts. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. And finally, you have no other choice, you must go on. Before conducting this experiment, Milgram asked psychiatrists and others to predict the results. Most estimated only 1 to 2% would comply fully, only those with sadistic tendencies. Milgram himself expected most participants would refuse once the learner expressed pain. The actual results stunned everyone. 65% of participants continued to administer shocks, all the way to the maximum 450 volts. This statistic forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Ordinary people, people like you and me, can commit harmful acts under the right circumstances. This isn't about a few bad apples. It's about fundamental human psychology. The participants' physical distress revealed their internal conflict. Many sweated profusely, bit their lips until they bled, or dug fingernails into their palms. They trembled, stuttered, and laughed nervously. One man developed a full-body tremor. Many pleaded with the experimenter to let them stop, yet continued when told they must go on. They knew they were causing pain. They wanted to stop, but they didn't. One participant protested. I think something's happening to that fellow in there. I don't get no answer. He might be dead. I don't know. I don't get no answer. The experimenter responded, "Please continue." And the man complied, delivering the next shock while visibly shaking. What happened in that laboratory? How did an authority figure, with no actual power over the participants, override their personal moral codes so completely? The answer reveals something profound about human psychology. When we enter situations with clear authority structures, many of us undergo what Milgram called an agentic shift. We transition from seeing ourselves as autonomous moral agents to viewing ourselves as instruments of someone else's will. Our normal moral questions, is this right? Or, am I causing harm? Get replaced by a different question. Am I following the rules properly? This agentic shift creates psychological distance between our actions and their consequences. We feel less responsible because we're following orders or doing my job. The experimenter repeatedly emphasized that responsibility rested with him, not the participant. This absolution was enough for many to continue actions they recognized as harmful. You can see this shift in everyday situations. When an employee implements a policy they disagree with, when a healthcare worker follows a procedure they know feels dehumanizing, or when you find yourself complying with a request that makes you uncomfortable simply because it came from your boss or an authority figure. In 2009, researcher Jerry Berger partially replicated Milgram's experiment with additional safeguards. Despite decades of ethics teaching and the experiment's fame, Berger still found about 70% of participants willing to continue to 150 volts, the highest level permitted for ethical reasons. Participants' reflections reveal the powerful psychological mechanisms at work. One wrote, "I believe the experiment was designed to help scientists improve the learning process. I trusted the experimenter." Another said, "If the man says to continue, well, he's the boss." Perhaps most revealing was this comment, "I was surprised to find myself doing what I was doing. I'm not that kind of person really, but somehow, I found I was." This captures the central revelation of Milgram's work. The gap between who we believe ourselves to be and how we actually behave under authority pressure. Authority's power doesn't come primarily from fear of punishment. The participants could have left without consequence. Rather, it comes from our socialization to respect credentials, defer to expertise, maintain politeness, avoid disruption, and fulfill social obligations. These prosocial tendencies make civilization possible, but they also make us vulnerable to manipulation. We don't consciously decide to abandon our moral agency. We slip into a different psychological mode where obedience becomes the primary virtue rather than independent moral judgment. What makes this finding even more troubling is that authority rarely operates in isolation. In real-world situations, authority combines with group pressure and role expectations. When facing both an authority figure and peers who comply, our resistance weakens further. This is where we need to turn our attention next, to understand how group dynamics transform individual behavior in ways that amplify authority's effects. The prison within, how roles reshape reality. What happens when ordinary college students are randomly assigned to play the roles of guards and prisoners? What invisible forces shape their behavior once they step into these roles? In 1971, psychologist Philip Zimbardo set out to answer these questions through what would become one of the most famous and controversial experiments in psychological history. Zimbardo wanted to understand how institutional settings transform individual behavior. His hypothesis was straightforward. Put normal, psychologically healthy people into a prison-like environment, assign them roles as either guards or prisoners at random, and see what happens. Would their innate personality traits determine their behavior, or would the roles themselves reshape how they acted? The setup was deceptively simple. Zimbardo converted the basement of Stanford University's psychology building into a mock prison, complete with cells, a yard area, and an isolation room. He recruited 24 male college students through a newspaper ad, offering $15 a day to participate in a 2-week prison simulation. These were stable, middle-class students who had been screened for psychological normality. Zimbardo's team flipped a coin to determine which students would be guards and which would be prisoners. The prisoners were arrested at their homes by real Palo Alto police officers who cooperated with the experiment. They were charged with armed robbery and burglary, read their rights, handcuffed, and taken to the police station. Blindfolded, they were transported to the Stanford prison, where they were stripped, deloused with a spray, given a prison uniform, a smock with their ID number, and locked in their cells. The guards received minimal instruction. Zimbardo told them they could not physically harm the prisoners, but should create feelings of boredom, fear, and powerlessness. They wore khaki uniforms, carried whistles and batons, and wore reflective sunglasses that prevented eye contact. Their job was to maintain order in the prison. Within just 36 hours, the simulation began taking on a disturbing reality of its own. The guards embraced their roles with unexpected enthusiasm, creating arbitrary rules and punishments designed to assert control. One guard later described his transformation. "I was surprised at myself. I made them call each other names and clean toilet bowls with their bare hands. I practically considered the prisoners cattle." The guards' behavior escalated quickly. They forced prisoners to repeat their ID numbers, do push-ups as punishment, and sing songs. They woke prisoners for midnight counts and turned basic functions like using the toilet into privileges. Guards held private strategy sessions to discuss control tactics, with each shift trying to outdo the previous one in psychological dominance. This transformation mirrors what we see in many institutional settings. Military recruits learn to dehumanize enemies through language and training. Corporate employees adopt company values that may contradict their personal ethics. Like putting on a costume that gradually fuses with your skin, the role slowly becomes inseparable from the self. Meanwhile, the prisoners underwent their own dramatic transformation. Initially, they resisted through rebellion, barricading themselves in cells and removing ID numbers. But after this rebellion was crushed, with guards using fire extinguishers and forcing ringleaders into solitary confinement, the prisoners became passive and compliant. They followed humiliating orders without question and began thinking of themselves as powerless prisoners rather than student participants. Some experienced emotional breakdowns and uncontrollable crying. 5 prisoners were released early due to extreme distress. One prisoner developed a psychosomatic rash over his entire body when his parole request was denied, a hearing that was entirely simulated. What makes this experiment so revealing is the speed of the transformation. These weren't people gradually socialized into institutional roles. These were college students assigned their roles less than a week earlier through a coin flip. The roles weren't real, yet they became psychologically real with astonishing speed. Zimbardo called this phenomenon role immersion. When we step into a role with clear social expectations, those expectations can override our personal identity and values. The uniform, the setting, the language used, all create a psychological reality that feels more immediate than our prior self-concept. A hospital nurse once described her transformation. "I came in idealistic, wanting to connect with each patient. By the end of the week, I was referring to people by their conditions, the appendectomy in room 4. It scared me how quickly I adopted the emotional distance I had criticized during nursing school." The Stanford prison experiment was stopped after just 6 days, less than half its planned duration. Christina Maslach, a graduate student who visited, was horrified by what she saw and confronted Zimbardo. This forced him to recognize how the simulation had spiraled out of control and how he himself had become immersed in his role as prison superintendent. The experiment has faced significant ethical criticism and could never pass an ethics review board today. Critics have questioned its scientific validity. French researcher Thibault Le Texier argued that the experiment was carefully manipulated to produce predetermined results, suggesting it lacked proper scientific rigor. Despite these valid concerns, the psychological insight remains powerful. Roles carry psychological weight. They shape perception, behavior, and identity. The line between playing a role and becoming that role is thinner than we like to believe. How did college students transform into brutal guards? The power of role expectations created a new psychological reality where cruelty became normalized as part of the guard identity. The uniform, the sunglasses, the baton, these weren't just props but psychological tools that facilitated a profound shift in self-perception. This understanding of role immersion connects directly to our next psychological mechanism. If roles can reshape reality so dramatically, what happens when we use language to reshape how we categorize other human beings? The process of dehumanization takes role-based behavior to its ultimate extreme, redefining who counts as fully human and therefore worthy of moral consideration. The language of separation, dehumanization's dark power. How does changing what we call people change how we treat them? This question has haunted me since I first studied the role language played in some of history's darkest moments. Words aren't just labels. They're cognitive frameworks that shape how we perceive others and what actions we consider acceptable toward them. Dehumanization works as a psychological mechanism that enables harm by removing normal moral concerns. When we categorize someone as less than fully human, we no longer feel obligated to treat them with dignity and care. Our brains literally process them differently. This feature of normal human psychology can be activated under certain conditions by anyone. I remember standing in the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., staring at Nazi propaganda posters depicting Jewish people as rats scurrying through sewers. These explicit recategorizations placed an entire group outside moral consideration. Nazi propaganda systematically portrayed Jewish people as rats, and ungezifa, vermin, stripping them of human dignity. This language prepared ordinary Germans to accept increasingly severe persecution. This pattern repeats in Rwanda, where Hutu radio broadcasts labeled Tutsis cockroaches before the 1994 genocide. Stations like RTLM instructed listeners to cut down the tall trees, code for killing Tutsi people. This psychological preparation made mass killing possible by ordinary citizens who had previously lived alongside their victims. Dehumanizing language functions much like peeling labels off canned food. It strips away identity, leaving only the contents to be processed, consumed, or discarded. Once the identifying markers of humanity are removed, what remains can be treated as a mere object or resource. Neuroscience research reveals that when we view someone as fully human, our medial prefrontal cortex, an area associated with social cognition, activates differently than when viewing someone we've dehumanized. We process dehumanized others more like objects than people. This neurological shift directly connects to how everyday language in workplaces, healthcare, and politics can subtly erode our perception of others' humanity. These findings explain why normal people commit acts they would otherwise find unthinkable. The dehumanization process bypasses brain circuits involved in empathy. Research by Susan Fisk and Losanna Harris showed that when participants viewed images of homeless people or drug addicts, their brains often failed to activate neural networks associated with social perception. The participants didn't register these individuals as fully human at a neurological level. Dehumanization operates around us in subtle forms. Bureaucratic language strips people of individuality through numbers and categories. Patients become the appendectomy in room 203. Immigrants become cases and aliens, and employees become human resources or headcount. These linguistic shifts enable decision-makers to implement policies affecting real people without experiencing the emotional weight of their choices. I witnessed this while observing a hospital staff meeting where administrators discussed bed utilization and turnover rates. Only when a nurse used patients' actual names did the conversation acknowledge the human impact of discharge policies. The subtle linguistic dehumanization had made it easier to discuss efficiency metrics without considering potential suffering. Research shows dehumanizing language affects behavior rapidly. In laboratory studies, participants exposed to descriptions of outgroups using animalistic terms showed less empathy toward those groups and supported more punitive policies. In one study by Costello and Hodson, describing immigrants using invasion and infestation metaphors led participants to express greater support for harsh immigration policies compared to those who read humanizing descriptions. This experimental evidence confirms what propagandists understand intuitively. Changing how we label people changes how we treat them, often within minutes of exposure to the new framing. Dehumanization creates a feedback loop. We treat dehumanized others poorly, observe their distress or resistance, then cite their reaction as evidence confirming our initial categorization. Contemporary examples appear in political rhetoric and social media. Political opponents become enemies of the people. Refugees are described as an infestation. People experiencing homelessness are called vagrants rather than neighbors without homes. Online spaces use terms like NPCs to dismiss entire groups as mindless automatons rather than thinking humans. These modern examples operate on the same psychological mechanism as history's atrocities, just at different points along the spectrum. The psychiatrist who labels patients as chronic cases engages the same cognitive process as the propagandist who labeled ethnic groups vermin. The difference is degree and context, not kind. Dehumanization becomes particularly dangerous when combined with authority and group dynamics. Authority-sanctioned dehumanization within a group creates conditions that accelerate moral disengagement. Military training employs dehumanizing language to overcome soldiers' resistance to killing. Enemy combatants become tangos, or targets. This linguistic shift combines with authority pressure and group conformity to transform ordinary citizens into effective soldiers. Institutional settings often create perfect storms of these factors. When prison guards use dehumanizing language within systems that authorize control and punishment, abuse risk increases dramatically. When medical systems use dehumanizing terminology within hierarchical structures, patient neglect becomes more likely. Dehumanization bypasses normal moral restraints that would otherwise prevent harm. It makes harmful behavior feel justified, even necessary. Once someone exists outside our circle of moral consideration, actions that would be unthinkable toward one of us become acceptable toward one of them. The frightening aspect is how normal dehumanization feels from inside. People engaging in it rarely recognize distortion. Instead, they experience their perspective as clear-eyed realism. This psychological certainty makes dehumanization resistant to challenge. Understanding this mechanism provides insight into how seemingly good people commit harmful acts, but also reveals something crucial about the path toward atrocity. People rarely jump directly from moral behavior to extreme harm. Instead, they travel down a gradual slope of increasingly problematic actions, each step making the next easier to justify. This process of incremental moral disengagement connects directly to our next psychological mechanism. The slippery slope that turns small steps to unimaginable acts into major moral violations. Could you be walking down a moral staircase without even realizing it? I've often wondered about this question while watching news stories about corporate scandals, political corruption, or personal falls from grace. The people involved rarely set out to commit major ethical violations. Instead, they traveled a path of small compromises that gradually led them somewhere they never intended to go. The concept of the slippery slope describes how minor ethical compromises pave the way for larger ones. Each small step down this moral staircase makes the next step easier and more likely. The metaphor suggests a gradual descent rather than a sudden fall, a process where people who consider themselves good can eventually participate in actions they would have once found unthinkable. I interviewed a former accountant who served time for financial fraud. He began with temporary adjustments to quarterly numbers, planning to fix them later. When conditions worsened, the adjustments grew larger. Within 3 years, he was falsifying major financial documents with no clear path to return to honest practices. This story illustrates a key insight from psychological research. Moral disengagement happens gradually. People don't transform from ethical to unethical overnight. They disconnect from their moral standards incrementally, through steps that individually seem minor, but collectively lead to significant ethical breaches. When we make that first small ethical violation, it creates psychological tension called cognitive dissonance. Our actions conflict with our self-image as moral people. This uncomfortable mental state demands resolution. Either change our behavior to align with our values, or change our thinking to justify our behavior. Unfortunately, we often choose the latter path. A manager uncomfortable about withholding information from customers might rationalize, "Everyone in the industry does this," or "Customers wouldn't understand the technical details." These justifications don't merely excuse the current action. They establish groundwork for larger deceptions later, expanding the zone of acceptable behavior. This process exploits our brain's adaptability. Just as our senses adjust to new conditions, like a noisy room eventually seeming quieter, our moral senses recalibrate based on recent behavior. After several small ethical compromises, actions that would have once triggered internal alarm bells begin to feel routine. Marketers and compliance professionals leverage this psychology through foot-in-the-door techniques. This persuasion strategy starts with a small request followed by increasingly larger ones. A classic study demonstrated this effect by first asking homeowners to place a small card supporting safe driving in their window. 2 weeks later, different researchers asked the same homeowners to install a large, unattractive billboard with the same message. Those who agreed to the small card were significantly more likely to accept the intrusive billboard. They had psychologically committed through that initial small step, creating a pattern of compliance that made larger requests seem reasonable. Our moral self-image shows remarkable flexibility in accommodating increasingly problematic behavior. We don't abandon our ethical self-perception. We modify our definition of ethical behavior instead. We reframe questionable actions through several mechanisms, minimizing consequences. No one was really harmed, dismissing victims, they should have known better, diffusing responsibility. I was just following procedure and appealing to higher loyalties. I did it for my family. The business world demonstrates this pattern repeatedly. Enron began with aggressive accounting that gradually evolved into outright deception. Employees who initially expressed concerns became active participants as their ethical thresholds adjusted over time. Political corruption follows similar patterns. Officials rarely begin taking large bribes. The path starts with small favors or minor conflicts of interest. Each violation recalibrates what feels permissible until shocking behavior becomes standard practice. Personal moral decline operates on these same principles. Betrayal of trust typically begins with minor boundary violations, flirtatious conversations, small secrets, or inappropriate thoughts. Each step prepares the ground for the next, larger violation. What makes this particularly dangerous is that organizations can deliberately create these moral staircases to normalize unethical behavior. Military training systematically desensitizes soldiers to violence through graduated exposure. Corporate cultures can incrementally normalize cutting corners through aggressive targets and implicit pressure to do whatever it takes. Ethical fading, where moral dimensions of decisions gradually disappear, often results from organizational framing. When decisions are presented through technical, financial, or efficiency lenses, ethical considerations fade into the background. People focus on meeting goals rather than considering the moral implications of their methods. A former corporate executive told me, "We discussed aggressive tax strategies and competitive market practices. The language made it impossible to see we were crossing lines. The pressure to meet quarterly targets overwhelmed everything else." Small ethical compromises lead to major moral violations through incremental disengagement, where each step makes the next easier and cognitive dissonance drives justification rather than correction. This process operates through normal psychology, our need for consistency, adaptive moral sensibilities, and capacity for self-justification. This understanding connects directly to Hannah Arendt's concept of the banality of evil. After observing Nazi official Adolf Eichmann's trial, Arendt was struck by his ordinariness. He appeared not as a sadistic villain, but as a bureaucrat who had descended a gradual staircase of moral compromise until unimaginable acts became simply part of his job description. What makes this concept so significant is that it shifts our understanding of evil from exceptional monsters to ordinary processes that can affect anyone. The danger isn't just that bad people do bad things, but that normal psychological mechanisms can lead ordinary people down paths where evil becomes routine, where atrocity transforms from unthinkable to simply part of one's daily responsibilities. This is where we turn next, to understand how evil becomes banal, routine, and bureaucratic in ways that disguise its true nature even from those participating in it. The banality of evil, when atrocity becomes routine. What happens when committing evil becomes just another day at the office? This question haunted philosopher Hannah Arendt as she sat in a Jerusalem courtroom in 1961, watching the trial of Adolf Eichmann. As a Nazi SS officer, Eichmann had orchestrated the transportation of millions of Jewish people to death camps. Given the scale of his crimes, Arendt expected to see a monster, someone visibly marked by the enormity of his evil. Instead, she encountered something far more disturbing, a balding, middle-aged bureaucrat who spoke in clichés and seemed genuinely puzzled that anyone would question his actions. Eichmann didn't present as a sadistic villain. He insisted he had no personal hatred toward Jewish people and spoke without ideological fervor. He appeared, in Arendt's words, terribly and terrifyingly normal. This stark contrast between the magnitude of his crimes and his ordinary demeanor led Arendt to formulate one of the most important psychological insights of the 20th century, the concept of the banality of evil. This psychological mechanism operates in many contexts where significant harm occurs. Evil can emerge through ordinary people performing routine tasks within systems where harmful outcomes have been normalized. Eichmann saw himself not as a mass murderer, but as a transportation logistics expert efficiently solving complex problems, taking pride in his organizational abilities and attention to detail. I've thought about Arendt's concept while interviewing workers in various institutional settings, from immigration detention facilities to pharmaceutical companies that priced life-saving medications beyond reach for many patients. Almost none described themselves as causing harm. They saw themselves as professionals doing their jobs according to established protocols. The psychological distance between their daily activities and the ultimate effects allowed them to maintain positive self-images while participating in systems that caused suffering. Systems that produce harmful outcomes develop sophisticated mechanisms to separate actions from their consequences. Bureaucratic procedures create layers between decisions and their impacts. Complex chains of command diffuse responsibility, so no single person feels accountable for the final result. Technical language transforms ethical questions into procedural ones. The Nazi bureaucracy exemplified these distancing techniques. The final solution became an administrative problem rather than a moral atrocity. Meetings focused on transportation logistics, cost efficiency, and processing capacity, not the human lives being destroyed. When Eichmann visited Auschwitz, he later recalled being disturbed by the sight of gassing victims. Not because of moral horror, but because the messiness contrasted with the clean administrative process he had helped design. Many people maintain separate ethical standards for their work self versus their home self. A manager who would never lie to friends might routinely mislead customers because that's just business. A kind-hearted person who donates to charity might implement harmful policies because those are the regulations. Research shows how easily this compartmentalization occurs. When people enter professional roles, they often adopt different ethical frameworks than they use in personal contexts. They prioritize loyalty to the organization, conformity to professional norms, and technical excellence over broader moral considerations. This shift isn't experienced as moral compromise, but as appropriate professional behavior. Bureaucratic language reinforces this compartmentalization by masking human implications. People become cases or applicants. Harmful outcomes become negative externalities. Deaths become casualties. This language fundamentally reshapes how people think about their actions by focusing attention on technical rather than moral dimensions. I interviewed a claims adjuster who regularly denied medical coverage based on technicalities. When asked how he felt about people potentially suffering because of his decisions, he seemed genuinely confused. "I don't make medical decisions," he explained. "I apply coverage criteria to submitted documentation." The bureaucratic framing had completely overtaken his perspective. These dynamics play out in contemporary institutions around us. Insurance companies deny life-saving treatments through routine processing. Government agencies separate families through standard immigration procedures. Corporations damage communities through normal business operations, justified by fiduciary responsibility. Harm results from ordinary people following established protocols while focusing on narrow technical concerns rather than broader ethical implications. The division of labor within organizations amplifies this effect by fragmenting responsibility. When each person handles just one small part of a process, moral awareness diminishes. The software engineer designing a small feature doesn't see how it fits into a discriminatory algorithm. The loan officer processing one application doesn't perceive systemic bias. The customer service representative, following the script, doesn't recognize exploitation. A former tech worker who helped design engagement metrics for a social media platform later discovered how these metrics had incentivized divisive content and contributed to polarization. "I was just optimizing for user attention," he told me. "No one talked about the social implications. We were focused on solving technical problems, not thinking about ethics." Arendt recognized that evil becomes most dangerous when transformed into routine processes carried out by ordinary people focused on efficiency rather than ethics. The greatest moral threat isn't the obvious villain, but systems that transform harmful outcomes into administrative procedures, carried out by people who never see themselves as doing anything wrong because they're simply performing their roles competently. This insight changes how we think about preventing harm. If the greatest harms often result from ordinary people performing routine functions within problematic systems, then our focus must shift to the systems themselves, to the structures, incentives, language, and procedures that enable normal people to participate in harmful outcomes without experiencing moral conflict. These mechanisms converge with particular clarity in historical atrocities, where ordinary citizens became participants in extraordinary harm. The psychological distance created by bureaucracy, the compartmentalization of identity, the technical focus that obscures moral dimensions, the fragmentation of responsibility. These factors combine to enable mass participation in systems of harm. My lie, Anatomy of a Massacre. How did ordinary American soldiers come to murder hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians? On March 16, 1968, in a small village called My Lai in South Vietnam, something happened that would forever change how Americans understood war and human behavior. Charlie Company, a unit of the U.S. Army's AmeriCorps division, entered the village expecting to find Viet Cong fighters. Instead, they found only women, children, and elderly men. What followed was one of the most disturbing episodes in American military history. The soldiers of Charlie Company were young men from small towns and cities across America. Factory workers, students, farm boys. Their average age was 20. They had been in Vietnam for about 3 months, had lost several men to mines and booby traps, but had yet to engage in direct combat with the enemy they knew was somewhere in the area. The frustration of fighting an invisible enemy had been building. They had been told My Lai was a Viet Cong stronghold, and that any civilians would have left for the market that morning. When these young Americans entered My Lai, they began systematically killing everyone they found. They shot people as they ran from their homes. They gathered groups of villagers together and executed them in irrigation ditches. They killed babies. They raped women and girls before killing them. By the end of the morning, between 347 and 504 unarmed civilians lay dead. Not a single shot had been fired at the American soldiers. The commanding officer of Charlie Company, Captain Ernest Medina, had briefed his men the night before the operation. Different soldiers later recalled his instructions differently, but many believed they had been ordered to destroy the village and kill everyone in it. Lieutenant William Calley, who led the first platoon into My Lai, clearly communicated to his men that their job was to kill everyone. This chain of command created the authority structure that enabled the massacre. When helicopter pilot Hugh Thompson flew over the area and realized what was happening, he landed his helicopter between the soldiers and a group of civilians they were about to kill. He ordered his door gunners to fire on the American soldiers if they tried to harm the civilians, and he called in additional helicopters to evacuate survivors. Thompson's actions demonstrate how individual moral courage can counter authority, but they also highlight how powerful the authority structure was for most of the soldiers involved. The explanation many soldiers gave afterwards centered on following orders. Paul Meadlow later described his participation in a television interview. He, Lieutenant Calley, told me to start shooting. I started shooting. I poured about 4 clips into the group. I laid them down. I just shot them down. When asked how many he killed, Meadlow responded, "I don't know. Too many." His mechanical description reveals how authority disconnected him from his own actions. The group dynamics within Charlie Company amplified the violence. Soldiers who might have hesitated found themselves surrounded by peers who were participating. The normal social restraints against violence were replaced by a new norm: participation in the killing. As one soldier explained, "I saw them do it, and I just followed. I just lost all sense of direction." Some soldiers refused to participate or actively tried to stop others. A few pretended to follow orders while intentionally missing their targets. These exceptions highlight that choice remained possible, but they also reveal how powerful the group pressure was. The majority chose conformity over resistance, even when conformity meant mass murder. The dehumanization of Vietnamese civilians had been happening long before My Lai. American military language referred to Vietnamese people as gooks, dinks, and slants, terms that stripped them of their humanity. The military strategy treated entire areas as free fire zones, where anyone present was considered an enemy combatant. Soldiers were taught to view all Vietnamese as potentially dangerous, erasing the distinction between combatants and civilians. This dehumanization appeared clearly in how soldiers later described their actions. One recalled thinking of the civilians as not even people, they're just animals. Another said he saw them as less than human. This recategorization allowed soldiers to override normal moral prohibitions against killing innocent people. The massacre at My Lai represented the endpoint of a gradual escalation of violence. Charlie Company had previously destroyed empty villages, killed livestock, and burned crops. Some had committed smaller acts of violence against civilians. Each step made the next one easier, creating a slippery slope toward the massacre. The days before My Lai had been particularly tense. The company had lost men to mines and booby traps. They had been told repeatedly that anyone remaining in the area was either Viet Cong or Viet Cong sympathizers. Their frustration needed an outlet, and My Lai provided one. As one soldier put it, It wasn't like going in and seeing the enemy. We were going into a village, and they didn't look like the enemy. Herbert Carter later recalled, "I went into a hut and killed a man, his wife, and 2 children. And the strange thing is I didn't feel anything about it. It was just like I was trained to do." Another said, "It was no big deal." The banality in these descriptions reveals how quickly atrocity can become routine. After the massacre, the military attempted to cover up what happened. It was only through the persistence of helicopter pilot Hugh Thompson and the investigative work of journalist Seymour Hersh that the truth eventually came out. Of the 30 soldiers who participated directly in the killings, only Lieutenant William Calley was convicted of any crime. He served 3.5 years under house arrest before being paroled. What made ordinary Americans participate in such atrocities? The convergence of multiple psychological mechanisms: authority, group pressure, dehumanization, and habituation to violence. No single factor explains what happened at My Lai. Rather, it was the perfect storm of psychological forces coming together in a particular context that overwhelmed individual moral restraints. My Lai wasn't unique. Similar incidents have occurred in other conflicts, carried out by soldiers from many different countries and cultures. The psychological mechanisms that enabled My Lai aren't specific to Americans or to that particular war. They're human mechanisms that can operate anywhere under the right conditions. This understanding connects directly to our next topic. If these psychological mechanisms can operate in the context of war, what happens when systems deliberately exploit these same vulnerabilities? How do propaganda machines systematically manipulate these psychological tendencies to turn ordinary citizens against their neighbors? The machinery of hate deliberately engineers the conditions for atrocity through careful exploitation of human psychology. Manufacturing monsters, the machinery of hate. How do propaganda systems transform neighbors into enemies worthy of destruction? I've asked myself this question repeatedly while studying how ordinary people become participants in atrocities. What I've discovered is that hatred rarely emerges spontaneously on a mass scale. Instead, it's carefully manufactured through deliberate exploitation of the psychological mechanisms we've been exploring. Propaganda weaponizes our existing psychological vulnerabilities. The same tendencies that make us respond to authority, conform to group expectations, categorize others, and adjust our moral standards incrementally can be deliberately manipulated. What happened at My Lai occurred without a formal propaganda system. But these psychological mechanisms become dramatically more dangerous when systematically exploited by sophisticated propaganda machines. The process resembles a slow-burning fuse leading to an explosion. At first, barely noticeable sparks of division appear, reasonable-sounding concerns about economic influence or cultural differences. The fuse burns gradually through stages of increasing hostility, with each step seeming logical to those caught in its path. By the time the explosion of violence occurs, the psychological groundwork has been so thoroughly laid that it appears almost inevitable to participants. Propaganda systems follow a predictable escalation pattern. They begin by establishing strong group identity during periods of hardship or uncertainty. This creates the psychological foundation of a cohesive us. Next, they introduce perceived threats from a targeted outgroup, activating defensive psychological mechanisms that contract the circle of moral concern. Authority figures and institutions provide legitimacy to these divisions through official-looking studies, statistics, and expert opinions. Finally, dehumanization intensifies gradually, transforming the outgroup from different humans into biological threats requiring elimination. Nazi Germany provides the most thoroughly documented case of this process. Their propaganda didn't begin with calls for extermination. Early messaging emphasized German national identity and pride during economic hardship following World War I. Jewish Germans were initially portrayed as different and problematic, but still human. Government offices produced charts showing Jewish control of various institutions, giving bigotry the veneer of legitimacy. The escalation followed a careful sequence that desensitized ordinary Germans. First came social exclusion and economic restrictions that seemed relatively mild. Then more visible persecution, identifying markers, public humiliation, and property destruction during events like Kristallnacht. Only after years of intensifying dehumanization did the Nazis implement mass murder, by which point much of the population had been psychologically prepared to accept or ignore what was happening. Diary entries from the period reveal this psychological adaptation. One German woman wrote in 1933 that regulations against Jewish businesses seemed extreme, but by 1938 she described violence against Jewish neighbors with disturbing indifference. The incremental nature allowed moral recalibration without triggering the internal alarm that a sudden extreme shift might have caused. In Rwanda, we see the same pattern compressed into a shorter time frame. Radio broadcasts spent months calling Tutsis cockroaches before the genocide began. The dehumanizing language transformed neighbors into vermin, making their extermination seem like a necessary cleansing rather than mass murder. The radio announcers became trusted authorities, providing permission and direction for the violence that followed. These patterns provide a template for recognizing dangerous propaganda in any era. The psychological mechanisms remain consistent. Establish group identity, create authority structures that legitimize prejudice, manufacture threats from the targeted group, dehumanize them incrementally, and normalize increasingly extreme actions against them. Today's media environment creates new vectors for these same psychological manipulations. Digital technologies allow propaganda to be precisely targeted to receptive audiences. Echo chambers reinforce increasingly extreme viewpoints without exposure to contradictory information. Anonymous online spaces reduce accountability for dehumanizing language. Viral sharing mechanisms reward emotional content that often demonizes outgroups. I've traced how everyday internet users moved from mainstream political frustration to increasingly radical forums, where dehumanizing language became normalized. The psychological journey followed the same pattern. Strengthening group identity, accepting the authority of ideological leaders, perceiving existential threats from outgroups, and gradually adopting dehumanizing frameworks that justified extreme positions. Understanding these mechanisms makes clear that propaganda isn't primarily about factual persuasion. It's about psychological transformation. It changes how people categorize others and what moral rules they apply to those categories. It shifts perception so completely that otherwise good people can participate in or tolerate tremendous harm while maintaining positive self-images. This understanding connects directly to how these same psychological mechanisms operate in digital spaces today. The tools and techniques have evolved, but the basic psychological vulnerabilities remain unchanged. Digital spaces create new opportunities for similar psychological manipulation, often without the central control that historical propaganda systems required. What turns ordinary internet users into digital tormentors? How do online environments enable the same psychological mechanisms we've seen throughout history? The digital world hasn't created new human tendencies. It has created new contexts that activate ancient psychological patterns in particularly powerful ways. Understanding these digital dynamics completes our picture of how good people digital dehumanization participating from trolling to tribalism without ever deciding what turns ordinary internet users into digital tormentors. I've spent countless hours watching this transformation happen in real time, seeing people who are kind and reasonable in person become unrecognizably cruel behind a screen. The digital world hasn't invented new psychological tendencies in humans, but it has created an environment that activates our darkest impulses with frightening efficiency. Online spaces create unique conditions that amplify the psychological mechanisms we've been exploring. Think about what happens when you go online. You're physically alone yet connected to millions, invisible to others yet able to impact them, free from immediate social consequences, yet able to receive instant gratification. These conditions create a perfect storm for human behavior to deteriorate. I interviewed a college student who participated in an online harassment campaign against a female game developer. I never thought of it as harassment, he told me. It felt like standing up against corruption in gaming journalism. But when I saw her talk about receiving death threats and having to leave her home, I realized we had caused real harm to a real person. His experience highlights the psychological distance digital interaction creates. Actions causing serious damage feel abstract and justified to participants. The real-world consequences of online behavior can be devastating. Teens have taken their lives after sustained cyberbullying. Public figures have gone into hiding after receiving credible threats. Ordinary people have lost jobs, relationships, and mental health after becoming targets of online mobs. In 2016, a man opened fire in a pizza restaurant because online conspiracy theories convinced him children were being trafficked there. The digital and physical worlds aren't separate. Online actions spill into real lives. Anonymity plays a crucial role in overriding moral restraints, functioning similarly to authority by reducing personal accountability. When hidden behind a username, normal social consequences disappear. You don't see disappointed faces or hear hurt responses. You don't risk your reputation. This creates what psychologists call the online disinhibition effect, the tendency to behave online in ways you would never consider in person. Research confirms this effect. A study asked participants to deliver criticism either face-to-face, by video call, audio call, or text chat. The more distant and anonymous the method, the harsher and more dehumanizing the criticism became. People who were polite in person became brutal when hiding behind text. Anonymity didn't create new personalities. It removed social restraints. Online group dynamics create powerful pressure for conformity and escalation. Social media platforms develop cultures with unwritten rules about acceptable targets. New members quickly learn that joining attacks earns social rewards, while challenging the consensus brings punishment through dogpiling or exclusion. The Gamergate controversy exemplifies this dynamic perfectly. What began as criticism of a female game developer quickly escalated into a massive harassment campaign. Thousands of people who considered themselves ethical gamers participated in increasingly extreme behavior. Doxing, death threats, and coordinated attacks that drove several women from their homes. Many participants later expressed shock at how far things went. Yet in the moment, group pressure normalized these actions. Digital dehumanization happens through mechanisms enabled by online environments. You don't see a complete human being, just a profile picture, username, and text. This reduction makes it easier to categorize someone as other and apply different moral standards. The distance reduces empathy. You don't witness the emotional impact of your words. The language of online spaces accelerates dehumanization. People become social justice warriors, incels, NPCs, or snowflakes rather than complex individuals. These labels flatten humans into caricatures, making it easier to dismiss their experiences. Each label carries implied permission for specific types of treatment. Certain groups become acceptable targets based solely on categorization. Online conflict typically follows an incremental pattern, creating moral slippery slopes. Few people jump directly into extreme harassment. Instead, they start with mild criticism that seems reasonable. As group dynamics reward escalation, behavior intensifies step by step. Each increment seems small, but the cumulative effect moves participants far beyond what they initially considered acceptable. A former participant in an extremist forum described this process. It started with edgy jokes, then slightly meaner jokes, then arguments about why certain groups deserved mockery. Before I realized what was happening, I was in conversations about violence that I would have found horrifying. 6 months earlier, research shows that ordinary people engage in behavior online they would never consider in person. One study found 41% of Americans admit to participating in some form of online harassment, including many who consider themselves ethical people. This creates cognitive dissonance resolved through justifications. They deserved it. It's just the internet. I was joking. Digital environments amplify these mechanisms by removing normal social restraints while adding anonymity and distance. They combine all the psychological factors we've discussed. They remove accountability, create powerful group dynamics, facilitate dehumanization through labeling, and enable incremental moral disengagement. The most disturbing aspect is how digital dehumanization reflects existing social divides. Online hatred follows patterns of power and marginalization already present in society. The same groups who face discrimination offline often experience the most severe forms of online harassment. Understanding these mechanisms doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but helps explain why decent people participate in it. More importantly, it points towards solutions. If digital environments currently amplify our worst tendencies, we can design spaces that do the opposite, that encourage accountability, humanize others, reward moderation, and make it easier to see the impact of our words. Resisting the invisible architecture. What psychological tools can protect you from becoming an unwitting participant in harm? I've spent years asking myself this question, especially after seeing how these mechanisms have operated throughout history and in my own life. The uncomfortable truth is that none of us are immune to these forces. Not you, not me, not anyone. I remember interviewing a former cult member who told me, "I always thought I was too smart to be manipulated. That belief was exactly what made me vulnerable. Her words have stayed with me because they capture something essential about human psychology. Our confidence that we're different, more moral, more aware, more resistant than others, often becomes our blind spot. The research is clear. Simply knowing about these psychological mechanisms doesn't provide sufficient protection against them. In one revealing study, participants learned about Milgram's obedience experiments and the power of authority. When asked if they would comply with orders to shock an innocent person, nearly all said no. Yet when those same participants were placed in a modified version of the experiment, their compliance rates were nearly identical to those who had never heard of Milgram's work. Knowledge without specific resistance strategies doesn't translate into changed behavior. So how do we resist harmful social pressures? The research points to several effective strategies. Resisting authority pressure *. Question the legitimacy of authority figures when their directives conflict with ethical principles. Explicitly reclaim personal responsibility with phrases like, "I'm not comfortable with this. I'm choosing not to participate." Create physical and psychological distance when you feel your judgment becoming compromised. I witnessed this last strategy in action when a junior employee at a financial firm stepped away from a meeting where his team was planning to misrepresent data. That brief distance allowed him to call a senior ethics officer, preventing a major violation before it occurred. Maintaining moral autonomy in groups *. Create an identity reference group separate from the pressuring group. Identify and connect with others who share your concerns, forming minority solidarity. Develop role distance. Participate in a role while remembering it isn't your complete identity. When soldiers who refused to participate in atrocities were interviewed, many described mentally. Consulting valued others, parents, religious leaders, friends, whose moral standards they wished to uphold. They asked themselves, what would this person I respect think of my actions right now? Countering dehumanization *. Notice categorical labels that replace individual identities. Watch for metaphors comparing people to animals, objects, or diseases. Replace statistical or technical language with human terms. The antidote to dehumanization involves deliberate rehumanization practices. When discussing policies affecting others, imagine specific individuals impacted rather than abstract categories. When conflicts arise, actively seek information about the experiences and perspectives of those you're in conflict with. Perspective-taking exercises provide powerful protection against dehumanization. Research shows that even briefly articulating the viewpoint of someone from a group you're in conflict with reduces dehumanization and increases recognition of moral worth. You don't have to agree with someone to recognize their humanity. Preventing ethical slippery slopes *. Establish clear moral boundaries in advance before situational pressures arise. Create specific if-then plans. If I'm asked to mislead a customer, then I will refuse regardless of pressure. Watch for warning signs, justifications you wouldn't accept from others, decisions you feel uncomfortable sharing, or actions requiring complex rationalizations. Create accountability structures outside the immediate situation. These warning signs function as psychological alarm systems, alerting you to moral danger. External perspective helps counteract the gradual adaptation that makes slippery slopes so dangerous. Building moral courage *. Practice emotional regulation under pressure. Develop clear moral priorities that guide decision-making. Start with small acts of resistance in low-risk situations. Moral courage strengthens with use. As one Holocaust rescuer put it, you don't suddenly become brave enough to hide someone in your attic. You become brave enough through all the small choices you made before. These aren't abstract concepts, but practical skills that develop through conscious practice. By implementing these strategies, we develop critical awareness that questions rather than accepts, moral anchoring to principles rather than situations, deliberate rehumanization of those being marginalized, and ethical pre-commitment that establishes boundaries before pressure arises. The responsibility this knowledge brings weighs heavily. Once we understand how these psychological mechanisms operate, we can no longer claim ignorance when we find ourselves participating in harmful systems. We must accept that resistance isn't automatic or easy. It requires conscious effort against powerful forces that have shaped human behavior throughout history. The question isn't whether these forces will affect you, but whether you'll recognize them when they do and have developed the psychological strength to resist. The line between good and evil doesn't separate us into heroes and villains. It runs through each of us, shifting with the invisible forces we've uncovered together. Everything we've explored shows how ordinary people can participate in extraordinary harm when caught in certain situations. Your greatest protection is humble vigilance, recognizing these mechanisms and choosing resistance, even when uncomfortable. Develop awareness of how authority, roles, language, and incremental changes shape behavior. Like a mirror reflecting our hidden vulnerabilities, the research shows we all could falter. Will you recognize the warning signs and find the courage to stand apart when it matters most?